All right, thanks all for coming out. It's great to have you here. It's my privilege to be able to talk about Dorothy L. Sayers today. She was a fascinating and prolific writer and intellectual of the 20th century. She was born at the end of the Victorian era, and Sayers' writing spans poetry, detective fiction, plays, theological writing, public lectures, and the Penguin Classics translations of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. So I don't recall when I first ran across Dorothy Sayers' writing, but I do know I've been quoting this lecture, The Lost Tools of Learning, since at least 2010. And that's our topic for today. Somewhere along the line, though, I read all of her detective novels, Lord Peter Wimsey, full novels, and also short stories. And I've been picking up the short stories again ever since I signed up to do this lecture, and that's been enjoyable for me. But in preparing for this, I've just been amazed at the breadth of her work, her thoughtfulness. She was a very intelligent thinker and could write about so many different topics. And throughout most of her writing, though, there are these common threads that are noticeably woven into the fabric of her work. And I'll talk about some of those today. What I plan to do in this brief talk is to provide an outline of Dorothy Sayers' life initially, particularly as it relates to her writing, before settling into a discussion of the lost tools of learning. My goal in doing so is to try to provide some insight into her context, what she was thinking about, what she was doing, where she was in her writing career and her intellectual journey as she gave this lecture. Her lecture, The Lost Tools of Learning, has had this enduring influence in Christian education, both within the classical school movement and also within the Christian liberal arts tradition. One of the main reasons for this, I think, is that Sayers concisely describes some of the problems that modern, that is 1940s post-war Britain education, many of which these problems have not left us. She concisely describes those, but then she goes on to give a remedy for that problem. And so it's not just in the critiquing that she's known, it's for the way in which she provides this answer, a full-scale remedy. And that remedy is to go back to the medieval period. So that's partially the part of my title here, her medieval turn, but that's also part of her larger program in her literary writing. Dorothy Sayers was born in Oxford on the 13th of June, 1893. She was an only child, and from what I have been able to pick up in biographical work is that she seems to have been very energetic, very imaginative, and probably quite precocious. So this seems to be who she was also as an adult in many ways. As far as her education, she went up to Oxford in 1912, and she read what was called modern language or modern French, which was essentially medieval French. She completed her coursework in 1915, but at that time Oxford did not grant degrees to women. So she had completed her work but had no degree. That policy changed in 1920, and Dorothy Sayers was one of the first women to receive a degree from Oxford University. As far as her writing career, you can kind of see this pattern or trajectory in her writing. She had these various periods of her work. So she published 2 collections of poems right after she completed her Oxford training in 1916 and 1918. But she's mostly known probably within the larger world for her detective novels about Lord Peter Wimsey, he's a lord, he has a privileged life, but he's got this hobby of detecting crime. So she wrote 11 Lord Peter Wimsey novels between 1923 and 1937, along with numerous short stories and other detective fiction during that time. She also collected and edited 3 volumes of great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, published in 1928, 1931, and 1934. She was a founding member of the Detection Club, which started in 1930, and she served as its president from 1949 until her death in 1957. Other members of the society included Agatha Christie, who succeeded her as president of the society, also G.K. Chesterton and A.A. Milne. She was also elected a charter member of the Sherlock Holmes Society in 1934. So this was a significant part of her life, was this detective world. But in 1937, this is when her last detective novel was published. There's a significant shift in her literary work. And she began to write plays and moved into theological writing. So there's a number of instigations for this, but she's mostly well known. The start of this is in 1937. She had been invited to write a play for the Canterbury Festival at Canterbury Cathedral. It was partially related to Charles Williams, who was one of the Inklings, had recommended her for this. T.S. Eliot had written The Murder in the Cathedral as a play in 1935, and then Charles Williams had written Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury for 1936, and then Dorothy Sayers' 1937, Zeal for Thy House, was the play that she put together and wrote for that. It was later produced in the West End, and it began a almost decade of playwriting that she was involved in. She talked about how it was actually a lot easier to write plays than to write books, shorter, not as much detail, and some of her biographers have suggested that she also liked the community aspect of the play and the drama world. She was somewhat dramatic herself, it seems, but writing a detective novel is a very solitary occupation, but then to be involved with directors and actors and other things seems to have been a joy for her. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about her plays, but she began to shift out of this play work and move into what I would sort of phrase as her medieval turn in the post-war years. Well, actually, toward the end of the World War II, Second World War, 1944, and onward. So part of this, it was again an instigation of Charles Williams. So Charles Williams' book, The Figure of Beatrice, 1943, came out. She read it, and in her essay, which was published in Essays Presented to Charles Williams, edited by C.S. Lewis. Essentially, it's the Inklings all wrote something here dedicated to Charles Williams, who at this time had passed away. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories was published in this volume as well, and comes right after her work, which was on Dante. But she says in there that it was Charles Williams' work on Dante that had spurred her into it, and she read it not because it was about Dante, but because Charles Williams wrote it. So that, and then also an air raid. Not too long after she read that, the air raid sirens are going off. She quickly grabs a book off the shelf, and it's Dante, and she's reading it in the air raid in the air raid bunker, and then from then on she's reading Dante. And from that we see that she would eventually publish 3 volumes of translation of Dante's Divine Comedy. The last one was co-authored posthumously with Barbara Reynolds, no relation, maybe distantly, but not that I know of. But these are some of the most read and purchased copies in the English language of Dante in the Penguin series. She also published 2 collections of essays on Dante during this period, 1954, 1955. So she moves from essentially detective novels to playwriting and theological work, which in there was The Mind of the Maker, which Dr. Adam Lee talked about before earlier in these lectures, and then onto her work on Dante and the medieval world. So it's in this context of the shifting into this medieval and Dante writing that she gives this lecture on the lost tools of learning. There is, though, even though I've mentioned it as a medieval turn, in some ways there's a medieval thread through all of her work. Because if you remember, her Oxford studies were in medieval French. Some of her poetry that she first published in 1916, 1918 was mimicking in many ways much of this medieval French poetry. And we see in her first major play, Zeal for Thy House, this is a play set in medieval Canterbury, and it wrestles with a number of issues. In a comment she makes in one of her essays in Unpopular Opinions, which was published in that book was published in 1946, but the essay itself came from the 1930s. She wrote, "As usual, the 16th century has got there before the 20th," talking about a number of different things. But she had done quite a bit of work on the medieval world as it had gone on throughout her work, and it's evident in much of it. So when she comes to this essay, The Lost Tools of Learning, she gives this lecture at an Oxford vacation course on education in the summer of 1947. From what I understand, these Oxford education courses were essentially for adults, teachers, students, working students who couldn't take courses during the year. It was sort of the beginning of continuing education in some ways. So sometimes there would be work done ahead of time, and there would be lectures that would be offered. So she gave this lecture then in 1947. The main premise of her lecture, I would say, is that students have not been taught how to learn. And she's running across this, and as a result of this, the society is vulnerable to being swayed by language, advertising, and propaganda. Now, she's giving this post Second World War. Propaganda has been a significant thing, both within mainland Europe with Germany and also within Britain, war propaganda. So there's part of that's in the context of this. But she gives a number of examples throughout the start of this lecture about how people are unable to write something that makes sense. How people have a difficulty in understanding what other people have to say. And she gives numerous examples of these sorts of things. And some of that also shows up in an essay that she had written earlier, which was published in this volume of essays called Unpopular Opinions. She says in the preface that she titled it Unpopular Opinions because people want to read stuff that's not popular. So it was I guess that was an advertising propaganda piece on her part. But she gives numerous examples, and the one of that essay is called Plain English. But what she gets at is that she says, "Are you often bothered by coming across grown-up men and women who seem unable to distinguish between a book that is sound, scholarly, and properly documented, and one that is to any trained eye very conspicuously none of these? Doesn't that frustrate you?" In 1939, she had given this presidential address to the Modern Language Association called The Dictatorship of Words. January 1939. Interesting topic. Dictatorship of words. And in this essay in Unpopular Opinions, Plain English, she writes, "A passage is not plain English, still less is it good English if we are obliged to read it twice to find out what it means." And another essay that was published here in Unpopular Opinions, The Creative Mind, which she initially gave as an address in 1942, she wrote this: "At the present time, we have a population that is literate in the sense that everybody is able to read and write, but owing to the evident emphasis placed on scientific and technical training at the expense of the humanities, very few of our people have been taught to understand and handle language as an instrument of power." 1942. She goes on in that same essay to talk specifically about Nazi propaganda, but how it should not have been surprising that people fell in with it. She said, "It was simply an exhibition of ruthless force, the employment of a very powerful weapon by experts who understood it perfectly against people who were armed to resist it, and who were not armed to be resisted, and had never really understood that it was a weapon at all. And the defense against the misuse of words is not flight, nor yet the random setting off of verbal fireworks, but the wary determination to understand the potentialities of language and to use it with resolution and skill." That same concept that she wrote in 1942 is at the beginning of this Lost Tools of Learning lecture that she gave in 1947. She goes through a number of examples in that, and at the end of sort of summing up the problem, she sums it up in this way. This is the quote that I always use in the lecture I give in the university studies class. "Is not the great defect of our education today, a defect traceable through all the disquieting symptoms of trouble that I have mentioned, that although we often succeed in teaching our pupils subjects, we fail lamentably on the whole in teaching them how to think. They learn everything except the art of learning. It is as though we had taught a child mechanically and by rule of thumb to play the harmonious blacksmith upon the piano, but had never taught him the scale or how to read music, so that having memorized the harmonious blacksmith, he still had not the faintest notion how to proceed from that to tackle the last rose of summer." That is the premise of the problem that she sets up in this lecture, and her solution to it. Oh, yeah, I forgot this. Part of the thing that's coming out of her advertising, her discussion of the use of words, is that from 1922 to 1929 or 31, depending on which source you look at, she worked for the Seton Advertising in London. So she worked as a job as an advertiser, which is where she got some of her work for the Lord Peter Wimsey novel, Murder Must Advertise. But she worked for a number of companies during that time: Lipton's Teas, Bovril, Coleman Mustard, and Guinness. And she is actually credited with this slogan, "Guinness is good for you." So behind, it's not just Nazi propaganda, I think, that she's concerned about. But her way forward in addressing this inability of dealing with this is to go back. To the Middle Ages. She says, "We cannot go back to the Middle Ages. That is a cry to which we have become accustomed. We cannot go back. Or can we?" She then goes on to go into a discussion of what these various terms mean. Go back. Is go back a retrogression? Or is go back the revision of an error? Two different meanings. She said the first is impossible. We can't really go back there. But second, wise people fix their errors every day. Cannot. Does this mean, quote, irreversible cosmic, is there some irreversible cosmic mechanism that keeps us from revising the error, or is it just very difficult in view of the opposition it would provoke? What do we mean by cannot? Middle Ages. She said the 14th century is not the 20th century. But she says, if the Middle Ages is, in this context, simply a picturesque phrase denoting a particular educational theory, there seems to be no a priori reason why we should not go back to it with modifications, as we have already gone back with modifications to, let us say, the idea of playing Shakespeare's plays as he wrote them. So in that way, she sets out that there's precedent for going back to the Middle Ages. So what she means by this, as far as education, is the liberal arts, the trivium of the liberal arts, which is set out as grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And the bulk of her essay and then is talking through how this works, what this would look like. So she sets these up as different age categories. So the grammar part of the trivium is for, she calls it the poll parrot age, the age when kids learn to memorize things and repeat things back. So from the ages of 9 to 11. Then the pert age, she refers to as this is the age 12 to 14, our tweens, early teenagers, when they like to talk back and when they like to argue with their elders. This is a great time for them to learn dialectic and how to argue. They're already doing it. Let's just help them do it. And then there's the poetic age, which she says is the difficult age. It's misunderstood, but it's the beginnings of creativeness. And this is sort of 14 to 16, which leads within the British education system up to preparation for university. So within the grammar stage, what she sees happening, then she goes through each of these parts. So within grammar, within dialectic, within rhetoric, what would it be? And her overriding point is that we shouldn't be teaching subjects. We should be teaching people how to learn, and you can use subjects as a method of teaching people how to learn. That's ultimately what is underlying the bulk of this. At the grammar stage, she says that students should learn an inflected language. So those of you who've taken Greek and other Latin and other languages know what an inflected language means. It means that there are specific endings at the end of words, that a word, based on the inflection, it can only mean this or be placed in that place, right? English is uninflected. And so as an uninflected language, you can move, it's the placement of words in the sentence where meaning. But she said that gets too much into the dialectic stage, because you're having to make arguments about, well, what is actually meant here when an inflected language is much more specific. Of all of these languages that are inflected, though, she says Latin is the best one. She gives a number of reasons for this, but then when it comes down to the type of Latin, she lands on medieval Latin as being the very important one that should be studied. Again, what is she doing at this point? She's beginning to translate medieval Latin of Dante, right? That's the world she's living in. But she's also, I think, coming at this from a sort of church Latin sort of perspective too. So at this stage, a lot of things it's memorizing. It's memorizing within English, verse, poems. She says the pupil's memory should be stored with stories of every kind. So it's about learning, memorizing. But again, this is all gathering material for the later stages of the trivium. So history is learning dates. You should have, she said, some sort of timeline students would be able to plug dates onto, right? That they can understand history. She's like, I don't care what it is. It can be kings. It can be this, that, or the other. Just that they have a place to sort of say, this is this point in history. As far as geography, learning maps, customs, capitals, rivers, mountains, all that sort of thing. Science, it's collection, identifying all these different parts. The grammar of mathematics, which is multiplication tables, addition, geometrical shapes, all those sorts of things. But she also would add on to this the grammar of theology. Because she says theology is the mistress science without which the whole educational structure will lack its final synthesis. Because in teaching students how to learn and not focusing on subjects, one of the underlying things that comes out of this is that she said students will realize that everything is connected. And ultimately it's theology, which is the connecting piece of it, that is what she sees as her goal. When it gets to dialectic, she goes back through these various topics again, starting with grammar here, though, is no longer language specifically, learning a language, but it's essentially logic and reason. So she says logic has been discredited partly because we've fallen into a habit of supposing that we are conditioned almost entirely by the intuitive unconscious. The practical utility of formal logic today lies not so much in the establishment of positive conclusions as in the prompt detection and exposure of invalid inference. You can almost sort of hear in the background here Professor Kirk in C.S. Lewis's Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe was published in 1950, 3 years after she gave this lecture. And then moving into literature and reading. It's now not about memorizing, but it's about debating what these things are about, learning how to write your own lessons, entering into mathematics with algebra and geometry, which she says is a sub-department of logic. And then history, beginning to think about, was such and such a justified action, rather than just learning about the date specifically, but learning primarily what she's talking about in this dialectic stage is learning how to debate. She said you can pull it from these subjects, you can pull it from anything around you. So she uses this example of boys where there's a story where it rained in this town and only half of Main Street got wet. And the other half was dry. So these boys debated for days. Well, did it rain or not? How many drops of rain are required for it to rain? How much needs to be covered for rain? She's like, who cares? They're learning how to come up with arguments and wrestle with us. We could talk about, is it a good idea to cancel classes before snow falls or after snow falls? Right? I mean, it's a similar sort of discussion. I know one of my kids in school today they've had debate in class, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? What are the pros and cons of the hot dog as a sandwich? And she talks about how the newspapers are full of good material for such exercises. Legal decisions on the one hand, in cases where the cause at issue is not too abstruse. On the other, fallacious reasoning and muddle-headed argument with which the correspondence columns of certain papers one could name are abundantly stocked. So again, the point is to train students in logic and argumentation. When it gets to rhetoric, the idea is to bring that into an elegant way and a concise way of making your argument. So it shifts quite a bit at this point, she says. She said a certain freedom is demanded. But within literature, it's not so much the deconstruction anymore, but it's the appreciation of literature. Having memorized literature and then having thought about what does it say, how do you argue with it, and now appreciating it again. She says appreciation should again be allowed to take the lead over destructive criticism, and self-expression in writing can go forward with its tools now sharpened to cut clean and observe proportion. So this is where she says also you can, at the rhetoric stage, you can move into subjects, but in the sense that you're beginning to study subjects with this foundation of the grammar and dialectic stage of the trivium. She says, I'm not here to consider the feelings of academic bodies. I am concerned only with the proper training of the mind to encounter and deal with the formidable mass of undigested problems presented to it by the modern world. For the tools of learning are the same in any and every subject, and the person who knows how to use them will at any age get the mastery of a new subject in half the time and with a quarter of the effort expended by the person who has not the tools at his command. She says, to have learnt and remembered the art of learning, make the approach to every subject an open door. If you know how to learn, you can learn anything. And she's pushing back against an education system which is, you have to know this about science, you have to know this about math, you have to know this, and these subjects are being siloed apart from each other, and students are given this material and you learn it, but then if you go from there, well, my teacher taught me that, I don't know how to gather that information myself. When you talk about this, you feel like, was she writing this last year? Right? As far as, well, students must learn programming. They must learn STEM subjects if they're going to survive in the world. She talks about how students at the dialectic stage will be behind in subjects of students who have been having the traditional education. But she said at the rhetoric stage, they will pass them hand over fist. She concludes with a section about how education has been living on this essentially educational capital for 300 years. Now we're almost 80 years on from her essay, so 400 years of capital. Since the Enlightenment, education is more or less focused more so on subjects with a scientific sort of turn. And so she says, the grammar of theology, the biblical understanding of the world, logic, and reason were ingrained in the educational system. Morality and ethics should be assumed even among those who did not believe in God. She goes on, but one cannot live on capital forever. And I think 80 years on from her essay, we are in the throes of dealing with that. So ultimately what she's talking about here is the goal of education is to learn how to learn, and to teach and to learn again and again. I'm going to close with some musings on the afterlife of her lecture, The Lost Tools of Learning. And then, if you'll pardon me, I sort of move a few comments into my own discipline more specifically. For such a brief lecture, in an obscure setting as an Oxford vacation course, Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning has had quite an afterlife. If a brief search through periodicals and the World Wide Web will turn up numerous republications of the essay, references to it. It was published numerous times right afterward. It was published in the Hibbert Journal in 1947-1948 volume. It was published in a volume much sort of like this by Methuen in 1948, which is the volume. That volume is accessible on Project Gutenberg Canada and also the Internet Archive. It was republished, and I think this publication in 1959 in the National Review in North America really gave it a new life. And it was republished in 1957, 1977 in another journal. These 4 volumes here that I have are all include editions of her of the Lost Tools of Learning. It's found in this the Great Tradition, Classic Readings on What It Means to Be an Educated Human Being, which was published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So she's in here with Plato, Aristotle, John Henry Newman, John Milton, and in numerous other collections you run across, Pope John Paul II, Aquinas. She's there with all of these great writings on education from the centuries. So, and you can also find it on almost any website related to classical education or homeschooling. This essay has been very significant in that entire movement. I would say it seems that she's the patron saint of the classical school movement. Maybe Dr. Massing could say more about that. But anyone who's thinking through the liberal arts, specifically the Christian liberal arts, you come in contact with this essay at some point. I appreciate the way that she incisively explains the challenges of education in the modern world, even if it's the mid-20th century. The inability, it appears, for the average person to be able to think, read, and write. The way in which society can be literate but illiterate is something that she very clearly explains. And it sort of makes you really hope you're not one of the people that she puts in this category of illiteracy. But we are inundated with words, as she highlights. And she says that in 1947, it was impossible to parry and fight back against the barrage of words. If she only knew. So, what is the place of her argument in a Christian liberal arts university setting? The vast majority of students entering university have not had this sort of education, right? In some ways, based on her age categories, it's too late for all of us to engage in the way that she has set it out. The university education, as she talks about, is supposed to be the quadrivium that comes after the trivium. And so what are we supposed to do in our university classes for students who have not come out of that? This is sort of where I'm I'm wondering. I don't think we can jump into dialectic and rhetoric in our introductory university classes as much as many of us would like to as professors. Can we get into discussions of literature when we don't really understand an argument, when we don't understand the meaning of words? I think we do have to take a little bit of a step back and introduce students into this in some way. From language, history, literature, mathematics, geography, and theology, and getting students to learn how to learn. These basics are missing in the elementary education system as much as I've experienced it as a parent. So how do we teach our students? This is a question for the faculty, for students. How do you learn how to learn in a context from what you come from? In my own discipline, when I teach Old Testament or New Testament introduction, I teach basic content of the Bible. I teach the historical timeline to peg the dates on. I mean, this is what she's talking about, the grammar of theology. That's essentially what I'm doing in a first-year university course. The storyline of God's redemptive story is not ready to hand for most students when they come into my classes. Yet, you have to talk about it in order to think about what's Paul's place in the early Jesus movement. What's Paul's argument? What he's saying? What's his context? How does this relate to Jesus' life? Yet it's the biblical and theological debates and disputations that most students are interested in doing, right? But the tools necessary for navigating and establishing the meaning of text and their content have been passed over. Too often I find that our reading of the Bible is not a reading, but an assumption or understanding that is dependent on what we've been told the Bible says. We have not read it for ourselves, nor have we taken the time to read the Bible on its own terms. And it is these pseudo-readings of Scripture that we use to support our views and arguments on contemporary Christian issues. Those issues often that few believers spent time being concerned about. We have lost the tools of learning, but they are still there. We just need to pick them up, brush them off, and begin using them. Learning how to learn, even if it takes a lot more effort. That's it. Yeah. All right. Any questions? Yeah. Well. Yes. Yeah, I think there's a space for primarily just using paper and pencil or pen. There's a space, though, for technology. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to put these slides together for you without technology. I would not have been able to access some of these sources without technology, without the internet, and finding them, right? So there's a way in which it's useful. Technology has become necessary, right? For communication, for a lot of different things. It's a useful resource for research. We don't have to go trudging around the world to visit archival libraries unless you're doing specific sort of work. A lot of that is available. I mean, most of even Sayre's own work is available through the Marion Wade Center at Wheaton College. Or you may need to visit there to get access to some of it, but it's available. So there are benefits. I mean, in my own writing, I do have to return to paper and pencil, pen at some points. to get things moving. I find it easier sometimes to compose that way, rather than on a blank screen with a blinking cursor, right? But I don't know what that is for your generation, because I grew up using paper and pencil and pen, and it wasn't till really university that I was beginning to use word processing software on a computer. I used an electronic typewriter in high school. So, which usually meant I was handwriting it and then typing it up, right? So the way in which thought and communication functions when you're physically doing it, I think, is different than when you're typing. It's not that it's bad or impossible, but it's different. So there's a place for technology, but I would encourage those of you who like are on screens more of the time to do take some time off and write. You'll find that within a half hour, an hour of handwriting, you'll do so much more than 2 hours on a screen sometimes. Anybody else?
We applied her ideas about learning to Tyndale. Would Tyndale look like professor of grammar, professor of dialectic? So we have to reorganize the entire operation around her categories. Since you're saying we're not at
right.
the quadrivium stage.
Well, not necessarily. I think, I don't know. I was thinking about how to apply this. That was definitely a musing sort of thing there at the end.
Would you have those three components in each course?
Right. I would think that you would think about how do you use your discipline to encourage learning. So most majors have introductory classes, right? And depending on the discipline, they're handled differently. But there might be ways in which you could create something across the board, so it simplifies it. But again, working in music, you have to basic notes and fingering or voice or whatever. There's some basic sort of things that have to be learned, right? Just like there's basic philosophical terms, there's basic interpretational terms, there's key texts and within English literature and other forms of literature that need to be learned right before you can move on. So in some ways, those introductory courses sort of function, I guess, as the grammar stage. And then as you're moving up, I mean, your discipline, philosophy, fits very easily with this, right? You got the intro of philosophy, and then you've got the critical reasoning, right? Which is definitely the dialectic stage and moving onward. I guess hermeneutics would be sort of a biblical studies sort of equivalent of biblical interpretation. Like, what are
So Sayers would actually advocate for having logic and critical thinking as a required course for all Tyndale students.
That's
so that at
right.
ABC, you will support that.
In the sense that logic and reason needs to be something that is taught in the argumentation step, right? But I mean, the challenge is that she sees this all happening up till the point of 16 years old, right? So by the time you get to university, you're in the full throes. But this also is the way the British system still works today. By the time you're moving into what is the forms, first form, second form, up to sixth form, you have already picked your future life career at the age of essentially 12. Whether or not you're going to university or not, whether or not you're going to focus and what you're going to focus on in university, because that's happening at that rhetoric stage in the 14, 16. And then you get to university and all you take is your discipline. So the North American system is very different than that. For us, we've got students, right? They're in their degree program. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm graduating in May. I don't know what I'm doing. So which is great. That's something that's possible within the liberal arts tradition, and I mean, I graduated with an economics and business major, so and I'm teaching New Testament, giving lectures on Dorothy Sayers. What's that have to do with business and economics? But again, all knowledge is connected in some way because, of course, God is the author of that knowledge and of the world around us, right? So there's benefit in learning. I mean, I could feel like I could have my own sort of Sayers turn in my literary career at this point, having read about her quite a bit more. Yeah, Rebecca.
I'm just thinking that she emphasizes the grammar stage of learning the importance of learning language. So that is another way you can encourage
Yeah.
people to learn Greek and Hebrew and French and Latin if you need it for your English. It gives that as an important stage of learning that we can still continue here.
Yeah. Yeah. And that at the undergraduate program, the BA, the language is a requirement. Some language. Yes.
Given your economy background, I'm curious what you think about how our economy works and how that has affected education, knowledge economy, and how people, their jobs have been down. How is that affecting education?
Well, yeah, you've had a commoditizing of education, but I think some of that is probably a reality because our governments are in charge of education, rather than it. So then governments become concerned with certain jobs. I mean, certain degree programs, like a Bachelor of Education, the government determines how many students may be in a classroom for a program. That's here in Canada. I'm from a country, grew up in a country that does not like that sort of government sort of decision making, but it's an attempt to sort of address it, but it's either delayed or it's late or it's early or whatever in the number. But I think in that commoditizing of education, it's the government runs it because it's a public good, right? Not everyone can afford to send their kids to a paid for education, but the society sees it's a benefit for people to be educated than to not be educated at all. So, but because of that, I guess there is some sort of shaping and movement. But I think now some of the push for STEM is the way, the way economy and society is moving, or it feels that it is. And so we need people who know these things. And there's also a concern by parents that my child needs to have a job that makes more money than I do, so that they can purchase a house in the GTA. I mean, I don't know, but there's a lot of those sorts of things that are involved in it. Rather than it is definitely a luxury to learn for the sake of learning. Well, what am I going to get out of this? I don't know. Right? There's a faith piece involved in that too, but if you don't have that faith piece, then there's a concern. Yeah, Scott.
So you mentioned that Dorothy Sayers was key in the homeschool movement in the U.S. as sort of a saint, and that people read this book and are very much influenced by the pedagogy as well. To what extent do you see this as a conflict between the homeschool educators and the government education, which they will see as propagandistic? And does Dorothy Sayers agree that public education is propagandistic because it doesn't give the kids the tools to learn? Do you think that's implicit in her? She's talking about the expending the capital of the past, and now we're bankrupt more or less. At least that's the trajectory. Is she suggesting that? Is that why the homeschool movement is national?
I think my sense from, you could do a whole talk just on the afterlife of this. Yeah. I think easily, and halfway through I thought maybe I should do that, but then I was like, no, that's going to take more time. But I think my sense is the homeschool movement you have people, it seems, that stumble across this after they've already decided to homeschool. I think that what am I supposed to do now? I don't know anything. I ran across a blog just yesterday of some mom saying, we decided to homeschool. I didn't know what I was going to do. Somebody told me about this essay, right? And then she goes on and talks about the essay. So I don't know if Sayers is not trying to do something subversive apart from the education system. She's trying to. This is like an idealistic view of what she would see the education system doing, which would still be the government-run system within the UK. I don't know if have I really answered your question, or I don't feel like I got to it. Yeah. Right.
And it is a tension now, like practically speaking, that movement in the United States, which is spread elsewhere. In some countries, they prohibit it.
Yeah, Germany doesn't allow it.
Germany, for example, but there are others as well.
Yeah. I don't know if what she's proposing goes against that. I think she sees that this is a model of education that could be used both within. I don't know if she's even foreseeing a homeschool movement, or even she's trying to say, how can we prepare people? They've just come out of the Second World War. People were led astray in multiple different ways within Europe, UK, and elsewhere. But this is a problem she was seeing earlier, and which is highlighted in a number of her essays. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I think our time is up. Let's thank Professor Reynolds for
All right. Thank you.